Yo, Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Shalom and goedendag mensen. Welcome to it. Another quick vlog. Shavua Tov to those who are, to those who observe the Sabbath and are now officially starting the new week. Shavua Tov to you. Happy New Week. And yeah, people, hello, welcome to it. Just as I begin this video, please, guys, if you even join the stream, hit that like button, please. Let's get the likes up. It really does help in pushing the video out. Please, please, please hit that like button, guys, whilst you are here. And maybe whilst you're at it, hit that share button also. And let's get some more people on the stream, because I want us to talk about this issue because it has so many... It has such a deep impact on the nature of the society that we're living in today. And before I even continue, guys, a reminder: I'm seeing you guys join the stream. Welcome to it. Welcome to Vlog 84. I'm up here in Johannesburg. My name is Sihle Ngobese, Big Daddy Liberty. Welcome to it. Welcome, welcome. We're gonna have a chat today about what I believe is the need for there to be an immediate ceasefire, a stopping, if you will, of this attack on South African men, on men in South Africa. I think there is a developing narrative in the mainstream that is driven a lot, of course, by the feminist type culture, the university academia, and of course the chattering classes who are effectively pushing this message of bashing men continuously and arguing that the incidents of gender-based violence, the incidents of rape, the incidents in this country that we often see, right? We often see and we know are a problem, but they will then argue that they are symptomatic of all men. And this is where you begin to see these sort of trendy lefty feminist campaigns, especially on social media, where, you know, they'll posit and paint men in the same brush and not even recognize that actually we are a society where a vast majority of men are good, upstanding, responsible individuals. And, you know, I before I get into this, because I will hit you with some facts, I will hit you with some data and some evidence. But I did think it's critically important to have this conversation. So welcome to it if you're watching. I do see the comments, guys, in the section. I'm going to keep an eye on those. Just whilst you're at it, please smash that like button. Let's get the likes up, people. I'm not seeing those likes coming up. I mean, let's at least bring you guys up to around 60 likes, and then I'll get straight into it. So whilst we're at that, let me just take a quick swig of water because I can feel my throat getting a little parched. And a reminder to you before I get into it as to what exactly we're going to be talking about here. Men in South African men, have begun to accept the mainstream narrative, which paints all of them as being the sort of abusers or the misogynistic type men. You know, we're told that you know, there's almost a vilifying of actual masculinity, and the vilifying of it happens because it's ill-defined. Firstly, it's ill-defined, and the definition of what masculinity actually really is often perverted. So we're going to have that conversation here as I say, stop the war on South African men. Now, I see those likes, guys, and we're sitting at 58, just two more, nearly there, and we'll get that conversation going. Oh, I bought sparkling water. Yeah. But welcome to it, guys. Hit that like button. Share the video, and we've just hit that 62 likes. So let's get straight into it, guys. You know, we live in a country where, let me begin here. I'm not denying that there are serious problems, societal problems and social problems related around, you know, the type of society that we are today. Of course, we know that we have very high incidence of gender-based violence, you know, both ways. But of course, the most predominant of which, being, you know, those men who really aren't men, and who act as boys, to be honest, and who don't understand masculinity, abusing women, raping women. We know this is happening. So please, if you think this video is about me denying that, please hop off the stream now, because that's not what this video is about. What this video really is about is having a look at what we actually call masculinity, number one. And number two, is South Africa genuinely a masculine society? If you define masculinity in the traditional sense of a man growing up responsible, a provider, a caretaker, a passer on, if you will, of values, especially in the setting of a household, a family, a familial setting. And as I mentioned, men traditionally playing that role of being a provider, a protector, and the passer on of values in the household. That is what masculinity really is. That is what we understand by masculinity. But the definition of it has slowly but surely been not only expanded over time, especially by the feminist types and the university lights, slowly but surely expanded over time and then completely perverted to mean all the absolute worst traits of a man in society. And of course, all of these theories that we often hear in the mainstream media are linked to critical theory, where there'll be these conversations about power dynamics and how men have always held the power in society, and that this power is lorded over, abused over women. And that, men by their very nature, we're told, are misogynistic and inherently prone to abusing women because of the patriarchy, we're told. This is all poppycock. It is all poppycock, because what it does, intentionally by many, but unintentionally by others who just parrot these talking points, is it paints all men as being somehow inherently evil or creating a system which is designed to subjugate women. That is clearly not true. That is clearly not true. Insofar as there have been historical influences in this country which have affected the role of a man in society. There are influences in this country, historical, right through our colonial days, apartheid, and even today's government, which has seen it's been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, removing men from their traditional roles in society, i.e. becoming, that transition from boys to men and being men who are family orientated, who marry, who create families, who have children, who rear, protect, and provide for children. We've removed that traditional role in society from right back to the days of colonialism. Now, and I'll go into details of why I say that. Right through apartheid and even today's government. And what you've seen develop out of this is a perverting and even shunning of those traditional male roles. Now, what do I mean by this? Let me unpack some of this. When I say that the traditional man and male role has been absolutely destroyed, and that men in real terms have actually been emasculated from a historical perspective, both by state policy and of course by a society which sought to destroy the traditional male figure. If you go back to colonial days, for instance, and even pre-colonial days, generally speaking, most societies were two-parent households, including within us, the African community, strong, stable family households. In Zulu, we refer to these, for instance, as the umuzi. There is a difference between indlu, a house, a physical house, and the umuzi, the household. The umuzi speaks to not only the physical infrastructure of a house, not only the physical infrastructure of a house, but also the relations in that house. The idea that you have a male figure, a father figure in the house who has certain responsibilities, protector, provider, passer on, if you will, of values, traditions, and even religion in most cases. That traditional role of that individual, and of course, his wife or wives, who also play an instrumental role. There was an understanding back then that one can't be the best iteration of who they are without the other. A man could never be a good, responsible husband without a good caring, inspirational, and cooperative wife. A female in the household who helped create the household, support the household, nurture the family, the man, and of course, the children. Now, where I'm going, where I'm beginning the story, is saying that what we see today of um, the breakdown of the family, the removal of the father figure from the household, hasn't always been the case. It's actually a relatively recent phenomenon if you look at it in a historical context, and where you begin to see the real breakdown of the family unit, especially amongst us, African, you know, I want to say tribal groupings, but effectively African households, where you start to see that real breakdown of the traditional roles between men and women, and of course the household, was really through the colonial days, where there was an incentive, by the government of the then colonial administration to remove men from these households, often in rural parts of the country, in order to extract cheap labor from them. And there's two means in which they really did this. Number one, they destroyed the quality of life of individuals in traditional households, especially as Zulus. If I can just take a moment to speak on that behalf, not on a behalf, but to speak from that perspective. The Zulu household, the Umuzi, was broken up by colonial legislation, which sought to remove fathers and sons, of course, men, out of the household and bring them into what was the burgeoning, in this case, manufacturing and mining industries in particular. So there was a concerted effort by administrators back then to remove men from these stable, traditional, and subsistence households, the Umuzi, if you will, and bring them into these urban centers where there were going to be cheap labor for the mines and the manufacturing. And there's two pieces of legislation on the colonial days that achieved that. The first, and both of them were aimed at destroying life, liberty, and property rights. Because if you have that, life, liberty, and property rights are almost the bedrock of secure families. And these are the things that I'm arguing, that were symptomatic of the Umuzi arrangement of the traditional households, especially as Zulus. Zulus were individuals who had land, i.e. property rights, bequeathed to us, through historical traditional systems. They had a high quality of life relative to their time, insofar as there was a lot of subsistence work and your wealth was measured in livestock and, of course, a sense of community as a clan. For instance, I'm part of the Ngobese clan, but I'll get to that later. And, of course, largely a lot of freedoms, insofar as, you belonged to something. You're part of a greater network that accorded you rights and freedoms within your community. Zulus, in particular, are a prime and good example of this. Now, I'm not saying things were hunky-dory and perfect. Guys, please, let's not do the whole thing of arguing an extreme to be a general principle. That's not the case. I'm just making a point here that actually there were structures and systems that existed and which were endemic and typified typified a South Africa pre the colonial days, and really a lot of the colonial legislation sought to disrupt this for its own purposes, mainly cheap labor in mines and in manufacturing, the burgeoning manufacturing that was especially happening on the Vaal. So what were these two pieces of legislation that disrupted this? The first was the hut and poll tax of 1910. The hut and poll tax was the hut and poll tax of 1910 was put in place precisely to disrupt the property rights of the Umuzi structure. How? It suddenly leveraged a tax on traditional people based on the number of huts, literally as the descriptor of the legislation suggested, and of course it levied a poll on these individuals. Suddenly, people who are living subsistence lives, livestock, agriculture, the creation of family and communities, found themselves having to pay a tax to colonial authorities, which they never had to pay before. Where were they going to get the money? And of course, where you got the money conveniently was if you could send your sons into the mines, into the manufacturing base that was developing to work as cheap labor to make the money. And that is what created effectively that migrant labor system that now typifies the South African society. So it was literally that piece of legislation, of course, and other pieces of legislation. I'm not saying this was like the be all end all, that began that process of breaking up traditional families, especially amongst African cultures and African tribal groupings, where you used to have the mother-father dynamic, even if it was a polygamous family, a father and lots of mothers. The point was it broke up those stable structures and suddenly introduced the notion of men being away from their families, working and living in hostile type arrangements in urban centers in order to pay for this damn tax, the Hudson poll tax of 1910, that was leveraged on mostly Black individuals. So you now see where the roots of this lie. It isn't somehow, because you often hear today, there's a lot of bashing of mostly Black men in particular. Oh, look at those Black men, they don't want to be fathers, they're irresponsible, blah, 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 blah. And I often say to people, no, take a moment to actually understand the history. And of course, I'm not saying excuse what's happening today, but take a moment to understand the history. That legislation by the state, that's why I'm very anti-state. I'm very anti-state and politicians. But it was legislation and policy by the state that created some of the social ills, or were the seed of creating some of the social ills that we see today. Where suddenly, by removing men from the household back then, it changed the whole culture of families back on the Umuzi plot, if you will. It changed the culture. Suddenly, kids were being raised with just a feminine influence exclusively in the household, breaking up what was essentially married households, nuclear families, and creating a situation where, with married people, that women now had to take up the role of being a father and the mother in the household, because the fathers and the men in the families were removed in order to go work in the mines, work in the manufacturing base, in order to pay this tax that was introduced, the 1910 Hudson poll tax. So of course it has cultural influences then. It changes the dynamics socially from a sociological perspective of a lot of Black families. And I only mention that, Black families because primarily that legislation targeted African Black men in order to remove them from the household to be the cheap labor. So it now introduced this dynamic which had never been there before, where women were raising kids alone. And what do you think happens then when you have successive generations of this trend develop, where young men, for example, are now raised in a highly feminized environment, where the male role models are removed from the household to work in these mines, to work in these manufacturing areas, and young boys at least, boys, were being raised primarily by women. That also has an effect culturally, socially, in terms of the personality development of men in a society. Boys being raised in a highly feminized environment. It has an effect, guys. And these are the things we need to talk about. These are things that we actually need to have a conversation about. Because then you can group in, if I keep it to that history lesson of how a lot of what we see today has historical context, you then, from the Hudson poll tax in 1910, you then see a continuation by the state of this trend of removing men from the household and into these compounds, these worker compounds, as cheap labor. The continuation of it, for example, now with the Land Act, the 1913 Land Act, which inculcated this idea that if you want to destroy the family unit in this country, you've got to target their life, their liberty, and their property rights. Hudson poll tax literally went after people's property rights, insofar as leveraging a tax on them that they never had to pay before, a tax based on their property, i.e. removing, therefore, men from the household in order to go work and and make some money to pay these taxes. The Land Act was just a add-on to this. It inculcated that systemic breakdown of the family unit, primarily by removing men, and not only removing men from the household, but also removing what was the traditional responsibilities of a man in the household. Provider, protector, provider, protector, and of course the inculcator of values to children. Suddenly men were not there to do any of this. Now fast forward from the colonial days through to apartheid, which effectively did the same thing. Because again, the incentive was to remove men from households to create a cheap labor system, where apartheid had things like, the Group Areas Act, influx control, etc., all designed primarily to remove men to create a cheap migrant labor system. And that has immense effects on the families that they're leaving behind. If you literally, as a young man growing up, as a young girl growing up in a traditional household, you have a mom and a dad. But 9 times out of 10 in the year, the dad is never there because he has to leave. He has to leave to work in the mine system or in the the manufacturing base that was developed and developing. And that has an effect on you as a young man growing up, because the only influences around you are highly feminized. Your sisters, your moms, your aunts. And that in and of itself is problematic, if I can appropriate the language of lefties. And that's problematic. But it's highly problematic because young boys to men in particular, need a positive, affirming, positive male role model, both in the household and of course in the broader community. And I'm putting it to you by demonstrating the how, that it was these systems of government and politicians who removed men, firstly, from those societies, and secondly, removed men from the communities, the household and in the communities. Know your history. Know your history, because it'll help you understand why we have the problems that we have today, where even though the Hudson poll tax is no longer here, even though the systems that created a migratory labor system by and large at a law level are no longer there, the culture that then formed around these things endured, it developed, it continued. Because now you created a narrative. On the one hand, there's a push and pull factor here. One, you created a narrative that it's okay for men to be away from the family. The other narrative, because it's a double-edged sword, is then you saw the rise of the feminist groupings. The feminist groupings that, the successive waves of them, but I won't go into that because I don't want to be long-winded, but there's successive groupings of feminist groupings that suddenly suggested, you know what we're seeing is okay. Because, as they say, you have the strong black woman trope that is thrown at us. That it's okay, women can't do it alone. It's, it should be fine and normal for a woman to be a single mother. Because women are strong women, strong black women. And again, that's not to say that you don't have women of character, very strong-willed, able to do this. Of course, that's not the argument I'm making. The argument I'm making is it was problematic that we normalized this, when in actual fact, we should have been repairing the family unit, encouraging the idea that every household should have 2 parents. Ideally, that should be encouraged. Whether that household is, a mother and a father, or 2 moms or 2 dads, because that's the other thing that, other people get pissed off when they realize that actually I'm not anti the lesbian and the gay community. What I am pro is creating stable families and households for children to be raised in. But even if you do have a LGBT community, There should be a recognition that a child needs positive male influence and a positive female influence simultaneous. But that's a digression. Let me stick to the notion of actual nuclear families, that we should be encouraging that. We should be encouraging and rebuilding this notion that the umuzi, the household, is umama and ubaba, and that the men in particular, especially young men, the same men, by the way, who've been raised by single moms and and highly feminized environments, those men inculcating positive role models for them. To say, my brother, when you are a man, when you are with a woman, marry that woman, number one, especially before you have a child. And number two, create a home for the two of you where you play your role as a man, and where na umama, you play your role in support of the men in your lives and, of course, the kids. But you talk about these things these days, woo, people lose their minds. How dare you say that only nuclear families are important, blah, blah, blah. You do know that there's a lot of single women, blah, 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 who are doing this themselves. Yes, I know that. But look at the amount of hardship that those single women are going through. When you switch off all the feminist nonsense that encourages this and you talk to actual women, they'll tell you it is very hard. It is very hard. And I've been left by a man to do this on my own. And the conversation we should be having, especially as men in society, is how do we bring those homies back into the household? Break the cycle of what history has given us. A history of state legislation, state policy that destroyed the family. How do we break that cycle and rebuild the South African family? How do we do that? And of course, I'll offer some interventions, but what we can't do and what we should reject doing is buying into this narrative that we should encourage single parent households. Because already, guys, it's a major problem. The last data I saw was of 2018, where of the number of new registered births, only 63% of new births in 2018 had no information on the father whatsoever. 63%, guys. This is a massive problem. A massive problem. And I'll take it one step further. There's research done by the South African Institute of Race Relations and the Human Science Research Council, HSRC, which found that 60% of children in this country have no sense of where their fathers are and are raised in single-parent households. Now, guys, this has a sociological impact. It has a real-world impact. Because if a single woman is raising a man or a boy, and if that environment is highly feminized, that boy, guys, I don't care what you say, because we see this in our society, that boy can develop some of the worst behaviors because a woman sometimes simply just cannot check the lash out behavior of a young boy who's transitioning into being a man. And sometimes you need a man and a positive role model figure in the household and in communities that say, hey, young man, we don't act like that. We don't react. We don't lash out. We don't react with violence or emotion to things. We think through. We are calm and blah, 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 blah. These are values that when you have positive male role models, you're raised with. Where masculinity is actually a very good thing. Masculinity speaks to being measured, knowing your strength, and knowing when not to apply it. And you always apply it for the good of others. The good being protecting others, providing for others, being a role model for others. That is masculinity. But because we don't have that, and we have a lot of young men who are raised almost generation after generation in highly feminized environments, you have young men lashing out and acting very emotionally, which is a very dangerous thing for men. Yo, Mensa, we've got to talk about these things. And we need to stop fearing the feminist types and the lefty types who are happy with the status quo, even as things are gonagala. I can't think of what gonagala is in English. In English, things are messed up. Things are messed up because no one wants to take responsibility and admit that actually we need to rebuild the family unit and encourage men, not only encourage, support men to stay in the household, be the provider, the protector. Support the women in your life. Employ masculine energy to be a protector, a provider, and an enabler of your wife, your girlfriend, and your children. That's masculinity. But we don't do that. And you see it in the current political elite, and of course their friends in the woke academia, the gender studies academia, who are more than happy to continue to pervert and maintain the status quo where the family unit is broken up and the men in particular are removed from the household, or they're not incentivized to be responsible. Not that they need to be incentivized, but empowered, to take up that positive male role model figure of being the father in a household, the responsible boyfriend, the responsible providing husband. Instead, we see a continuation in this language that no, women must go it alone. Don't mind there not being a male or father figure in your household. The state will take over the role of being the father figure in the house. The state will take over. The social grants, so you don't need a man. Rather marry the state. That is a highly toxic policy approach. Highly toxic policy approach. Well, what we should be doing, as I keep an eye on time, what we should be doing is saying, no, actually, firstly, encourage. Young man, before you have a child, marry the girl. And then once you're married, do your level best to get assistance, both in terms of building networks in a community, where you build a network where you've got positive role models, male figures who've been there, who maybe have been married for a long time, to guide you, to counsel you. Bring back the traditional leadership. Bring back the religious leadership. If you're Christian, I know a lot of pastors provide marriage counseling and pre-marriage counseling. Use those sort of things. Those are quality services that help build up the self-esteem of men. To say, brother, you can do this. You should do this. You should be a responsible ubaba in the household, where you provide leadership in the household, where you respect your wife. Your wife is literally your other half. And that you are a unit that then creates children and creates a family. These are the values we should be encouraging. Guys, even again, because I know what's going to happen in the comments. You're going to have the people who come on and say, this is so 1950s, blah, 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 blah. But you can't be saying that and at the same time saying nothing when you watch society around you collapse, simply because we're not allowing men to play the role that they should be playing. And equally, we're setting up women for failure, convincing them that it's somehow desirable for them to go it alone, when we can see the hardship they're enduring. An incredibly selfish policy approach. And I call it selfish because it does harm to the child. So you can talk all that good stuff that you want to talk, the strong black woman or the strong woman doing it alone, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, very little of that conversation talks about the impact of that on the child. Don't believe me? Go to some of these communities, for instance, that are plagued by serious social issues, such as gangsterism. Find out amongst gangsters, if you're brave enough to talk to them, how many of you here were raised with a father figure in the household? And you'll hear crickets. And that when those young men are lashing out, looking for that disciplining, value inculcating, and responsible male figure, they look in the wrong spaces, i.e. mostly gangs. And gangs, by the way, are awake to this. They know that young men who are lost, feeling lost, are seeking a male edifying figure. And where do they find that? In gangs. You know, I spoke to, there's the fly in the car. Hey, I spoke to a gentleman who did work in the prison, South African prison system. And he was unequivocal and to the point, and saying, brother, one of the biggest problems we're facing in this country, especially with the breakdown and inability for boys to transition to being responsible men, is the lack of positive male figures. Beginning with the father in the household and extending itself to being in strong communities, cohesive communities, where the fathers, the men are there. And that in the prison system, you then talk to guys where, in his assessment, he says 80% plus had no sense of having been raised by a father. So, as I conclude and I summate, we need to stop what has now become the norm in this country of man bashing, on the one hand, and number two, what has become the norm of excusing men who don't take responsibility. And number three, not only excusing them, but then arguing of that minority of men who don't take responsibility, not only as fathers, but also as just men in society. We then argue that no, actually all men are like that. And you start seeing these trashy nonsense, highly, feminized and actually feminist nonsense that bashes men and argues that men are actually not needed. That's a very dangerous thing to perpetuate, because I argue that it's no different to what the colonialists did, it's no different to what apartheid did, and it's definitely no different to what the ANC government, the government of today, is doing when it yokes its friends in these sort of gender theory, gender studies friends who push a dangerous narrative that men are not needed. We shouldn't bring the father figure back in the household. We shouldn't insist on, in a community, building strong, cohesive communities where the men are there, primarily as positive role models. It's a very dangerous thing. When we generalize about men and we paint them with the same brush, when actually, if you open your eyes and you look around you, men are actually beginning to do the work of reclaiming that narrative away from the feminist types and actually saying, no, we're not what you're saying we are. We're responsible. We love our wives. We love our girlfriends. We love our families. And that what we should be doing as responsible men is being the loudest voice in the room, both to push against the toxic narrative that the feminists have cast on to men, and also to hold other men accountable, to bring back that energy of saying, no, men should be the ones who check each other. And to do so in an environment of free speech, where you allow men to speak up and speak out. Because trust you me, what you're actually beginning to see is a toxic coalition of these feminist types. And again, I don't say this to cast a negative brush on all feminists. There really is a particular type of feminist grouping who are actually just anti-men, but hide behind feminist notions as we traditionally understood them of seeking equality between men and women. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. That's your first wave type feminist, who the vast majority of us support for obvious reasons, because there really should be equality of opportunity between men and women in all facets, socially, economically, blah, blah, blah. That's not the issue here. The issue is that latter type of feminist, who's actually rather anti-man and is basically hiding behind slick language to continue a status quo that is prejudicial to women in the process of trying to be pejorative to men. And that's very dangerous, because we as South African society are paying the price for that status quo. We're paying the price of it in just look around you. Young men who are lost, absolutely lost. Why and why? Because we've encouraged this notion that it's okay. It's okay for young men to be raised in highly feminized environments. And then when they act out because they don't have a male influence to guide them, we then call that toxic masculinity. And then all men are like that. That's nonsense. That is absolute nonsense. And if you don't believe me, do a little experiment for yourself to see what it looks like when men actually organize. And when men organize, number one, and create systems and social bonds amongst each other, those systems are always based on bringing out the best of each other. Just look at a rugby team or a soccer team or whatever the case may be, and go into that team and look at the camaraderie. It's very close, it's very tight-knit. It's men who are empathetic, compassionate, strong, and understand when to use strength. That's masculinity. They support each other. They have a sense of a grand plan, and they work towards something. They're able to cooperate with each other to work towards that grand plan. I'm saying to you, if that can happen at a soccer team level or a rugby team level, it should be the same culture, the same ethos we encourage at a societal level. Food for thought. Food for thought. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. Because we cannot beat the social ills that we face in this country if we don't focus on building the sort of man that we want and encouraging men to stay in the family, to create family, to put out those values that we know we want, that are actually linked to what masculinity really is. Raising young men to be the sort of people who provide leadership, not only of themselves, but of actual cohesive communities and families, where women are seen as an integral part of what supports and creates and builds a society of responsible men, as opposed to telling the genders, no, we don't need each other. In fact, when as a male, you're useless. When as a female, even though you're enduring tough times, you're a strong woman. Suck it up. That's very dangerous. That's very dangerous. And it sees us be unable to create a liberty-minded society because we're too far mired in social issues that actually can be really addressed if we push values that recognize and empower men, responsible men in society, and push more of that out as a positive role model figure so that other men pick up, learn the cues, and become those sort of men. And at the same time, supports the women in our society to say, no, you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to live that life of hardship. Life is tough as it is for a woman, the modern woman. Life is tough as it is. Even with all the legislation that supports equality for women and opportunity, and life is tough as it is for a woman. And that actually masculinity is a man supporting women in that society as a partner, as a girlfriend, as a wife, as a sister, as a mother, whatever. That's real masculinity. So let's stop this nonsense of hashtag men are trash, hashtag the patriarchy, blah, 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 hashtag women are victims and all that. No, Let's stop that nonsense and actually go back to empowering the genders in this country. To say, brother, you have a role to play in society. As a fellow man, me to you, I'm going to check you, keep you in check, keep you motivated, keep you being the sort of provider, the protector, and the enabler of our values, our culture, etc., in society. To say, sister, I've got your back. Whether you're my girlfriend, a wife, my sister, my neighbor, whatever that may be, I've got your back. You are 100% safe because we are here as responsible men. If we can have that two-pronged approach and then focus on rebuilding the family, rebuilding our communities, removing policy that removes fathers from the household, Food for thought, guys. Food for thought. These sort of ideas are what builds what I like to call the faith, flag, family, and freedom type society. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. I'm going to keep an eye on that. I did keep an eye on some of the comments, guys. Very interesting and lively chat I see is happening. Shout out to you guys. Thank you for watching. Remember, smash that like button, guys. Get those likes up. Get those likes up. And please share this video. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. Maybe you're one of those people who is, the ultra feminist types that I talk about, who don't believe that men are requirements in society, who don't believe that there are traditional and necessary roles of the father figure, for example, the positive role model in a community. Maybe you're one of those. Tell me why. And then tell me how that's worked out for us as society. Or maybe you're someone who actually believes in those traditional values and says, yeah, actually, we need to rebuild the family. We need to bring the father back into the household. We need to look after our young boys, raise them up to be men, for them to understand what masculine energy really is. It isn't beating women. It isn't being, King Kong type vibe. That's not masculinity. Masculinity is tied to values of being a provider, a protector, an enabler of others around you. In other words, using your strength to enable others around you, whether it's children or women, and of course, the pusher of values and culture onto the next generation. The builder of a home. That's masculinity. That's masculinity. So let me know what you think, guys. Thanks for watching. I'm going to try and have an episode of Liberty and Friends tonight. We're going to have Dr. Franz Cronier on the show. I'm having a few technical issues, but I will put information on that out shortly. Guys, thanks for watching. And as I said, let me know what you think. Like the message. Share it, please. Share the video. And drop a comment. Let me know what you think. And with that being said, a reminder to you, as always, as I always end my videos, for you to never trust a commie or even a third-wave feminist.